The call came on a Tuesday evening, 5 days before Thanksgiving, while I was grading papers at my kitchen table. My name is Thora, I'm 32 years old, and I teach high school history, a job I have loved for 10 years and never once been ashamed of. I was halfway through a stack of essays on the French Revolution when my phone lit up with my mother's name, and I answered the way I always did, with a small, preparatory exhale, the kind your body learns automatically when a relationship has trained it to brace. Thora. Her voice had that particular texture, warm on the surface, load-bearing underneath. I need to talk to you about Thursday. Okay, I said. I set my pen down. Derek is joining us this year. A pause, calibrated. Vivian is very serious about him, and we want the evening to make a certain impression. I waited. I think it would be better if you didn't come this year. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street below. I looked at the stack of essays. A student had written the guillotine was not mercy, it was efficiency in red ink, underlined twice, and I felt something in my chest go very still. Because of my job, I said. It wasn't a question. A beat. My mother was skilled at pauses. She used them the way other people used words, to manage, to redirect, to make you feel that the thing being said was somehow your own conclusion. Derek comes from a certain world, sweetheart. Patricia said his last girlfriend was a venture capitalist. We just want. Patricia, I said. You mean you. Another pause. Longer this time. It's one dinner, Thora. You understand. I said I understood. I said goodbye. I set the phone face down on the table and sat there for a long time, looking at the essay about the guillotine, and thought about how efficiently certain things can sever. I should give you some context, because that phone call did not arrive out of nowhere. It arrived at the end of a very long road, and if you want to understand what happened next, at the gala, with Margaret, with everything, you need to understand what came before it. I am the older of two daughters. Vivian is 28, 4 years younger, and she has been the center of our family's gravitational field for as long as I can remember. Not because she demanded it, though she did, eventually, but because my parents built it that way, and she simply grew into the space they created. Vivian was the beautiful one, which in my family meant the important one. She modeled briefly in her early 20s, then pivoted to luxury brand consulting, which meant she wore expensive clothes to expensive lunches and advised wealthy clients on how to spend money they already had too much of. My mother found this glamorous. My father, Harold, found whatever my mother found. I went to university on academic scholarship, got a master's in education, and spent a decade teaching teenagers to think critically about history. My students won regional essay competitions. One of them wrote to me last year from her first year at Oxford. I have a wall of their cards and letters in my classroom that I look at on the hard days. My mother had never once asked to see that wall. I don't say this looking for sympathy. I say it because understanding the architecture of a family requires understanding where the weight is distributed, and in ours, it had never been distributed evenly. I had spent 32 years accepting my position as the load-bearing wall, essential to the structure, invisible to everyone living in it. The Tuesday call was not the beginning of anything. It was the accumulation of everything that had come before it, finally reaching a point I couldn't domesticate into something bearable. There was, however, one thing my family did not know about me. Her name was Eleanor, my grandmother, my father's mother, and she had died 14 months earlier at the age of 81, leaving behind a carefully constructed irrevocable trust valued at $15 million. The trust named Vivian as sole beneficiary. It named me as sole trustee. Eleanor had told me about it 3 years before she died, sitting in her kitchen over tea, her hands wrapped around a blue ceramic mug she'd owned since before I was born. She had looked at me with the particular clarity of someone who has outlived her illusions and said, I'm giving Vivian the money because she'll need it. I'm giving you the control because she'll need that more. I had not told anyone. Not Rachel, not my parents, not Vivian. I had kept it the way Eleanor asked me to, quietly, competently, invisibly. The way I kept everything. After the phone call, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I picked up the stack of essays, finished grading them, and went to bed. I didn't cry. I wasn't sure what I felt, exactly, something flatter and more durable than sadness. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been told, one more time, that their presence is a liability. What I didn't know yet was that 5 days later, while I was eating cereal alone in my apartment on Thanksgiving morning, Derek Hartwell's financial advisor was running a background check on everyone connected to Vivienne Mitchell. And my name was about to become very interesting to a lot of people. I had a good life. I want to be clear about that. The Tuesday call stung, but by Wednesday morning I was standing in front of 31 juniors explaining the causes of World War I, and the classroom, its particular smell of dry erase markers and old textbooks, the particular energy of teenagers who are half bored and half fascinated, did what it always did. It steadied me. My friend Rachel taught English 2 doors down, and we had the kind of friendship built on shared lunches, honest conversation, and the mutual understanding that teaching is both more important and more undervalued than the people who have never done it tend to believe. She was waiting by my classroom door at noon on Wednesday, a container of leftover pasta in each hand. "You look like someone canceled Christmas," she said, handing me the one with the red lid. I told her about the phone call while we ate. Not all of it. I didn't mention Eleanor's trust, which I never mentioned to anyone, but the essentials, the exclusion, the reason, the one dinner framing. Rachel was quiet for a moment after I finished. "Then, what did your dad say?" "He wasn't on the call." "But you've spoken to him since?" I looked at my pasta. "He texted. Said he hoped I had a nice holiday." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I had told myself for years that my father's passivity was a form of love, that his conflict avoidance was gentleness rather than abdication. That call, that text, were the clearest evidence yet that I had been misreading him. He wasn't gentle. He was absent. There's a difference, and pretending otherwise had cost me more than I'd been willing to calculate. "What are you doing Thursday?" Rachel asked. "Probably grading. Maybe a walk. Come to mine. My aunt makes too much food every year and pretends to be surprised." I smiled. "I'll think about it." I did go to Rachel's, in the end. Her family was loud and warm and slightly chaotic, the kind of Thanksgiving where 3 conversations happen simultaneously and nobody's plate is ever quite empty. I sat at their crowded table and ate stuffed peppers and watched Rachel argue cheerfully with her cousin about a football team neither of them actually followed, and I thought, this is what a family dinner is supposed to feel like. Not performed. Not managed. Just present. My phone stayed in my coat pocket all evening. I didn't check it. The weeks after Thanksgiving passed in the ordinary rhythm of late autumn: papers to grade, a departmental meeting about curriculum adjustments, a student who needed extra support ahead of finals. I had almost convinced myself that the exclusion was a singular event, a one-time cruelty I could file away and move past, when my mother called again on a Friday evening in early December. Her tone was different this time. Lighter, which in my experience meant she wanted something. "Vivien's birthday is the 21st, she said. "We're doing dinner at Clarendon, you know, the new place on 5th. Derek will be there again." A pause. I understood the shape of it. "And?" I said. "And we'd love for you to come, of course. Derek is so curious about the family, and it would look strange if I wasn't there this time," I finished. "Vivienne would love to see you." Vivienne had not called or texted me since the Thanksgiving call. Not to apologize, not to explain, not to check in. The invitation was not from Vivienne. It was a stage direction from my mother. I was needed to complete the picture, to fill the family tableau, having been removed from it when it required a different composition. "I'll let you know," I said. I didn't go to the birthday dinner. 3 days after I declined, my mother called again. This time the lightness was gone. "You're being difficult," she said. "I'm being consistent," I replied. "You asked me not to come to one dinner because my job was embarrassing. I've decided to take that seriously. Silence. That's not what I have papers to grade, Mom. I'll talk to you soon. I hung up before she could restructure the conversation. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, heart beating faster than the situation warranted, and noticed something. I felt better. Not happy, not healed, but cleaner, somehow. Like something that had been accumulating pressure had released a small amount of it. I didn't understand yet how much pressure was still building elsewhere. It was Rachel who first mentioned Derek by name in a context that wasn't just Vivien's new boyfriend. She'd been at a charity event for the Arts Foundation she volunteered with, a mid-December fundraiser in the city, and she came into school Monday morning with something particular in her expression. "Your sister's boyfriend," she said, setting her coffee down. "Derek Hartwell. What about him?" "He's on the board of the Alderton Foundation. He was there Saturday night." "Thora, he's not just wealthy. He's serious wealthy. Like, the kind of person who has people who manage his people." I absorbed this. "Did you speak to him?" "Briefly. He's very polished. The kind of polished that takes work." She looked at me carefully. "He asked about you." Something shifted in me, not alarm exactly, but attention. A sharpening. "What did he ask?" "Just who you were." "I said you were Vivien's sister, a teacher, a good person." She paused. He nodded like he was filing it. Looking back, that was the moment I should have understood that the landscape was changing. Derek wasn't simply a wealthy boyfriend, he was a man who gathered information. His interest in me was not social. It was due diligence. And somewhere in his financial ecosystem, someone was already pulling a thread that would unravel everything my family thought they knew. I thanked Rachel and went to my first class. But the word she'd used stayed with me all day. Filing. The new year arrived quietly. I spent New Year's Eve at Rachel's apartment. We opened a bottle of wine at midnight and watched fireworks from her window, and I felt the year turn with a kind of measured optimism, not hope exactly, more like willingness. Whatever 2024 held, I intended to be less permissive with it than I'd been with what came before. I had a meeting with Margaret in the second week of January. Margaret Caldwell was Eleanor's attorney and the trust's administrator, a composed woman in her late 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades translating complicated situations into actionable clarity. We met quarterly to review the trust's performance and any distributions requested. Eleanor had structured the trust conservatively, a diversified portfolio generating reliable income, and in the 14 months since Eleanor's death, I had approved 2 modest distributions to Vivian, one for a professional development course, one for a security deposit on a new apartment. Vivian had never thanked me. She didn't know I was the one who approved the money. As far as she knew, the distributions came from the trust, an abstract institutional entity rather than her older sister's authorization. "The trust is performing well," Margaret said, setting a folder on the table between us. "Approximately $15.3 million in current valuation." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Has Vivian made any contact with you about distributions?" "No," I said. "She contacted my office last week," Margaret said. "She's requesting a lump sum distribution of $200,000. For investment purposes." She mentioned a business opportunity with Derek Hartwell's company. I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of business opportunity?" She was vague. "Which concerns me." Margaret folded her hands. "As trustee, the decision is entirely yours. I wanted you to have the full picture." Something felt wrong, and I couldn't yet name what. A $200,000 request framed as an investment, connected to a man whose level of financial sophistication would make him fully aware of what proper due diligence looked like, and yet the request came from Vivian, vague and undocumented, to an attorney's office rather than to me directly. Either Vivian didn't know I was the trustee, or she did know and was deliberately going around me. "I'll need documentation of the opportunity before I can consider any distribution of that size," I told Margaret. "Please let her know." Margaret nodded. Of course. I drove home through the gray January streets and sat in my parking garage for several minutes before going inside, thinking about Derek's polished composure at the fundraiser. The way Rachel had said filing. I was beginning to understand that I was already a character in someone else's story. I just didn't know which one yet. The documentation request went unanswered for 3 weeks. During that time, I noticed a shift in my family's communication patterns. My mother, who had been calling weekly since the Thanksgiving incident, alternating between guilt and subtle pressure, went quiet. My father sent a brief text in late January asking if I was well, which was unusual enough that I read it twice. Vivian had not contacted me directly in months. The silence felt managed. Coordinated. Like people who have had a conversation I wasn't invited to. In early February, Rachel mentioned Derek again. I did a little reading, she said at lunch, the careful tone of someone who has been thinking about whether to say something. Derek's company is in a complicated position right now. There's a merger on the table, one of those things where the financing structure matters enormously. He's been very visible at fundraisers lately, very generous with donations. She looked at me. Building a profile. A reputation, I said. Or a paper trail of good standing. She paused. Thora, I'm not trying to alarm you. But if he's building something and your sister is part of his picture, and she's connected to a $15 million trust. Rachel. My voice was quiet. She stopped. How do you know about the trust? A beat. She looked genuinely startled. I don't know anything specific. I just assumed, after what you've told me about your grandmother, that there was money somewhere. I wasn't. It's fine, I said. But my heart was moving faster. I had never told Rachel about Eleanor's trust. Not the amount, not the structure, not my role. And yet she had arrived close enough to the truth to make me wonder, if Rachel, who knew only what I'd shared, could sense the shape of it, what could Derek Hartwell's financial advisor see? The answer came 11 days later, on a Wednesday evening, in the form of 3 rapid knocks at my apartment door. I opened it to find my mother, my father, and Vivian. Vivian was wearing a coat I recognized as new, camel-colored cashmere, the kind of purchase that requires a certain confidence in future income. My mother's expression was composed in the way of someone who has rehearsed. My father stood slightly behind them, looking at the floor. Can we come in? My mother said. I stepped aside. They arranged themselves in my living room the way people do when they've arrived with a purpose, my mother on the couch, Vivian beside her, my father in the armchair near the window. I remained standing, which I did deliberately. We know about the trust, my mother said. No preamble. No pretense of a different reason for the visit. That itself was information. The situation had moved past the point where management was possible, and my mother had made the tactical decision to lead with directness. Do you? I said. Derek's advisor found it. During a financial review. My mother's voice was steady, but I could see the effort required to keep it that way. You're the trustee, Thora. You've been the trustee for 14 months and you never told us. I looked at Vivian. She was watching me with an expression I'd never seen on her before, something between anger and a kind of unsteady confusion, like a person who has just discovered that a room they thought they knew had an entire wall they'd never noticed. Grandmother asked me not to, I said. She asked you, Vivian started, and stopped. Eleanor built the trust carefully, I continued. The structure exists for a reason. Vivian is the beneficiary. I'm the trustee. Those are different roles with different responsibilities. You approved distributions without telling anyone, my mother said. I approved distributions according to the trust's terms. Which is my job. I looked at her steadily. I approved Vivien's deposit for the Kensington apartment. I approved her professional development course last spring. A silence. Vivien's expression shifted. That was you, she said quietly. That was me. I watched her process it, the recognition that the money she'd received, the money she'd treated as an institutional given, had passed through my hands. That I had approved it. That I had done so without comment, without leverage, without making her feel indebted. And I wondered if she understood, in that moment, what that said about me, and what her silence all those months said about her. My mother recovered first. Vivian needs access to a larger distribution. For the investment with Derek. The trust is her inheritance, she has a right. She has a right to distributions according to the trust's terms, I said. Which require documentation of the investment purpose and my approval as trustee. I requested documentation 6 weeks ago. It hasn't arrived. Because Derek needs the funds confirmed before he can provide the documentation, Vivian said, an edge entering her voice. That's how these things work. That's not how trust distributions work, I said. My mother leaned forward. Thora, we're asking you to be reasonable. This is Vivien's money. It's Vivien's inheritance, I said. Managed according to grandmother's instructions. Eleanor was very specific about what she wanted. I intend to honor that. You intend to control it, Vivian said. The edge had sharpened into something harder. I looked at her for a long moment. I intend to be responsible with it, I said. Which is why she gave it to me. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges things. My father, who had not said a single word since entering my apartment, looked up from the floor briefly and then looked away again. My mother's composure developed a visible fracture line. Vivian stood up. We're not done with this, she said. I know, I said. They left. I stood in my living room after the door closed and listened to the building's particular quiet, the hum of the elevator, a neighbor's television, the distant sound of traffic, and felt, beneath the adrenaline, something that surprised me. I felt steady. In the following 2 weeks, 3 things happened in sequence that I've come to think of as the trust's own chain reaction. First, Margaret called to inform me that an attorney representing Derek Hartwell had contacted her office requesting documentation of the trust structure and my appointment as trustee. Margaret had declined to share anything beyond what was publicly registered and confirmed that all inquiries should be directed to me. I thanked her. Second, I did something I should perhaps have done earlier. I had a long, careful conversation with Marcus Thompson, a financial advisor Rachel had recommended, about the $200,000 distribution request and its specific context. Marcus listened without expression and then said, if what you're describing is accurate, the merger timeline, the undocumented investment framing, this distribution request has the structure of someone using a beneficiary's trust access to shore up a financing gap. He looked at me. That's not an investment. That's a bridge loan he can't get from a bank. Third, Vivian called me on a Thursday night, and for the first time in the history of our adult relationship, she sounded uncertain. Derek's advisor is asking questions about the trust that I can't answer, she said. About distribution history. About conditions. Because you didn't know the conditions, I said. A pause. Did you know it was me? Before Derek's advisor found it? Another pause, longer. I knew there was a trustee. I didn't ask who. That was honest, at least. And that honesty, the first piece of genuine communication Vivian had offered me in years, felt important, even if it had arrived for pragmatic reasons. She wasn't calling because she'd missed me. She was calling because she needed information. But she was also, I sensed, slightly shaken. The power dynamic she'd understood all her life had a seam in it that she hadn't seen before. The Alderton Foundation Charity Gala is next month, I said. I'll be there. We should talk then. A pause. Why there? Because it's neutral ground, I said. And because I think it's time for a few things to be said in front of people who can hear them clearly. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice had recovered some of its composure. Fine, she said. I hung up and looked at my phone for a moment. Then I opened my email and composed a message to the Alderton Foundation's events coordinator, confirming my attendance at the gala in my capacity as founding donor. Eleanor had established the endowment in 1987. The foundation had her name on a wall in the lobby. I had never mentioned it to my family. The gala was held on the third Saturday of March, in a ballroom on the 14th floor of a downtown hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city lights. I arrived 20 minutes before my family. I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, a deep navy that Rachel had helped me choose, fitted and simple, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself but doesn't apologize either. I signed in at the registration desk, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, and took my position near the window. The room filled gradually. I recognized several faces from the foundation's annual correspondence, board members, long-term donors, the executive director, a woman named Jasmine who had been coordinating foundation events for years and who greeted me warmly with both hands extended. "Ms. Mitchell," she said. "We're so glad you could make it. The Eleanor Mitchell room is open for tours this evening, if you'd like to bring anyone through." I thanked her and watched the entrance. They arrived as a group, my mother in a black dress with architectural shoulders, my father in a suit that fit him well, Vivian in something ivory and deliberate, and Derek Hartwell, whom I was seeing in person for the first time. He was exactly what Rachel had described, polished in the specific way of a man who has learned that the right presentation is its own form of power. Tall, composed, a practiced ease in rooms like this. He moved through the entrance with the unhurried confidence of someone who expects to belong everywhere he goes. His eyes found me across the room immediately. He already knew who I was. I could see it in the fraction of a second before his expression settled, a flicker of recalibration, the adjustment of someone who has been briefed but is now performing the encounter as if he hasn't. That small moment told me everything I needed to know about how he processed information and people. My mother saw me and paused almost imperceptibly. Then she continued across the room with her composure intact. "Thora," she said, leaning to kiss my cheek. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I come every year," I said. "I just never mentioned it." I watched the information register. Vivian and Derek arrived at my side a moment later. Vivian's expression was a complicated architecture, something between wariness and the social performance required by the setting. Derek extended his hand. "Derek Hartwell," he said. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." "I'm sure," I said, and shook it. A brief exchange of pleasantries, the weather, the room, the foundation's work. Derek was skilled, the conversation moved with professional smoothness. But I could feel him assessing, which was fine. I was assessing too. After a few minutes, Jasmine appeared at my elbow to introduce me to a board member. As she drew me slightly aside, she said quietly, "Should I mention the naming at dinner, or would you prefer to do it yourself?" "I'll mention it," I said. "If the moment arises." The moment arose during dinner. The seated portion of the evening involved a brief program, remarks from the executive director, a short film about the foundation's recent grantees, a recognition of major donors. I was seated 2 tables from my family, close enough to observe without being in direct conversation range. When the executive director mentioned the Eleanor Mitchell Endowment, the founding gift that had established the foundation's arts education program, Derek leaned slightly toward Vivian and said something I couldn't hear. Vivian's expression remained controlled, but her posture changed almost imperceptibly. After the program, during the movement back toward cocktail hour, Derek approached me alone. My mother and Vivian were across the room in conversation with another couple. "The Mitchell Endowment," he said, without preamble. "Eleanor Mitchell was your grandmother?" "Yes." "And you're a trustee?" A pause. "Of more than one thing, it seems." I looked at him steadily. "My grandmother believed in this foundation for 37 years. She established the endowment when I was 3 years old. I'd been involved with it in various capacities since I was old enough to understand what it did." He nodded slowly. The processing I'd noticed at the entrance was more visible now, the recalibration of a man who had constructed a picture and is now encountering a dimension that wasn't in it. "Your sister mentioned that there were some complications with a distribution request," he said. "There are conditions," I said. which is how my grandmother structured the trust. The conditions exist to protect Vivien's interests over the long term, not to obstruct them. A pause. $200,000. Requires documented purpose and trustee approval. I kept my voice quiet, without heat. I'd be happy to discuss the documentation requirements with whoever your financial team wants to designate. The process is straightforward once the paperwork is in order. He studied me for a moment. A new quality entered his expression, not hostility exactly, but a kind of respect that carries its own edge, the recognition of someone who has encountered a boundary that is not going to move. I see, he said. I think you do, I said. He excused himself. I watched him cross the room to Vivian and say something brief. Vivien's gaze moved to me across the space between the tables. My mother was watching too now. Her expression was a thing I'd rarely seen on her face, something stripped of its management, something that looked, briefly, like surprise. What I felt in that moment wasn't triumph. I want to be accurate about this. It was something quieter and more specific, the particular sensation of a person who has spent a lifetime being the invisible daughter and is now simply, clearly, undeniably visible. Not because I'd done anything dramatic. Because I had simply stopped disappearing. The confrontation, when it came, was my mother and Vivian finding me near the window during the post-dinner cocktail hour. My father was with them this time. Harold. He stood slightly to the side, as he always did, present but peripheral, a man so long accustomed to occupying the margins of his own family's dynamics that he'd forgotten he had the option to step forward. You planned this, my mother said. Low, controlled. I plan to attend a gala I attend every year, I said. You knew Derek would be here. You knew the foundation would come up. I knew it was possible. I looked at her. Mom, I've attended this gala for 7 years. Eleanor's name is on a room in this building. I never hid any of that from you. You never asked. Vivien's voice, when she spoke, was different from any tone I'd heard her use before. Stripped of its usual brightness, its performance of ease. Why didn't you tell me it was you, she said. When I asked for the distributions. Why didn't you say? Because grandmother asked me not to conflate the roles. She wanted the trusteeship to function on its terms, not on our family dynamic. I paused. Which, given what happened at Thanksgiving, I think you can understand. A silence. Vivian looked away briefly. The 200,000, she started. I'm not approving it without documentation, I said. That's not personal, Vivian. It's my legal responsibility. I paused. But I'll tell you what I am going to do. I'm going to request that Margaret schedule a meeting with both of us, so you understand exactly what the trust contains, what the conditions are, and what options you actually have. You're the beneficiary of something significant. You should understand it. Vivian was quiet. Something moved across her face that I couldn't entirely read, not gratitude, not yet, but maybe the beginning of a question she hadn't known to ask before. My mother opened her mouth. My father, for the first time that evening, spoke first. That sounds reasonable, Harold said. We all looked at him. He was looking at me, and his expression, quiet, uncomfortable, but direct, was the most present I had seen him in years. That sounds very reasonable, he said again. The meeting with Margaret happened in early April. Vivian came alone, Derek was not invited, and whatever negotiation had happened between them about that, Vivian arrived without him. Margaret walked her through the trust structure with the patient thoroughness of someone who has delivered complex information to unprepared recipients before. The total valuation. The distribution conditions. The timeline. My role as trustee and what it meant in practical terms. Vivian sat across the table from me for the first time as an adult in a room where we were both simply ourselves, not performing for our mother, not competing for a gradient of approval that had never been evenly distributed. She asked questions. Some of them were good questions. At the end of the meeting, When Margaret stepped out briefly, Vivian looked at me and said, "She gave you the control because she thought I'd spend it badly." "She gave me the control," I said, "because she loved you enough to want it to last." A silence. "That's a generous way to frame it," Vivian said. "It's what she told me," I said. Those were almost exactly her words. Vivian looked at her hands. Then back at me. "The Thanksgiving call was my idea," she said. "Not just Mom's. I told her I thought it would be easier if you weren't there." I was embarrassed, and I told myself it was practical, and she stopped. Started again. "I'm sorry, Thora. I'm actually sorry." I sat with those words for a moment. Vivian had never apologized to me, not in any way that cost her something, not in any way that didn't come with a structural revision that softened the admission back into manageability. This was different. This was the specific weight of a person who has looked at something clearly and found it ugly. "I know," I said. "Is that enough? I mean, is it?" "It's a start," I said. "It's more than I expected, honestly." She almost smiled. "That's a terrible thing to say." "Probably," I agreed. I deferred the $200,000 distribution request for 12 months and attached conditions. Vivian would complete a financial management course certified by the trust's administrator, and the investment purpose would require full documentation reviewed by an independent financial advisor. Margaret drafted the conditions, I signed them. Vivian didn't fight it. That surprised me more than anything else. Derek's merger, as it turned out, restructured without the distribution. I learned this from Rachel, who heard it through the foundation grapevine. The merger went through on different terms. Whatever bridge he'd been building with Vivian's inheritance, he'd found another way across. I thought about what that meant for Vivian, whether she understood what had almost happened, and decided that was a conversation for later, when trust between us had accumulated enough to hold it. My relationship with my parents evolved in the months that followed, in the incremental and imperfect way that real things evolve. My mother called in May, on a Sunday evening, and the conversation was different from any we'd had before, shorter, less managed, with longer silences that weren't used as weapons. She didn't apologize directly. My mother was not a woman who apologized directly. But she asked about my students, which she had never done before, and listened while I told her about a girl named Jasmine who had won a regional history award. She said, "You must be very proud of her." It was small. It was real. My father called me separately, the following week, and apologized. Haltingly, uncomfortably, with the self-consciousness of a man who has not had practice with direct emotional expression. He said he'd been watching from the wrong place for too long. I told him I appreciated him saying so. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, a book he was reading, a repair he was doing on the house, and the ordinariness of it was its own kind of repair. Looking back on the whole arc of it, the Thanksgiving call, the visit to my apartment, the gala, the meeting with Margaret, I can see the thing I couldn't see when I was inside it. I had spent years believing that acceptance from my family required shrinking. That making myself smaller, quieter, less inconveniently real would eventually earn me the presence in their lives I wanted. What I understand now is that the opposite was true. They didn't start seeing me until I stopped disappearing. And the instrument that forced me to stop disappearing wasn't revenge, and wasn't strategy. It was simply Eleanor's trust, structured around the premise that love sometimes looks like accountability rather than indulgence. It's summer now. School is out, and I have mornings that belong entirely to me, coffee on the small balcony of my apartment, a book, the particular quality of light in early June that falls through the buildings at an angle that makes everything look briefly possible. Rachel is getting married in September. She asked me to give a reading at the ceremony, and I said yes immediately, and we spent an afternoon choosing between 3 poems before agreeing on one that made us both cry slightly and then laugh about it. The trust is managed. Vivian is 3 months into her financial course. She texts me occasionally, nothing profound, small things, a question about the course material, a meme she thought I'd find funny, a photograph of a meal she'd cooked that actually looked good. I text back. We are not close yet. We might become close. I don't know. I joined the Alderton Foundation's advisory board in July. It felt like the right completion of something Eleanor had started. Her work continued through mine, the endowment animated not just financially but through active involvement. Jasmine, the events coordinator, showed me the room with Eleanor's name on a small brass plaque beside the door, and I stood there for a moment and thought about the blue ceramic mug and the kitchen and what Eleanor had said about love looking like accountability. I think she was right. I think she was right about most things. What I carry forward from this year is not bitterness, it released, gradually, the way winter does, not all at once but in stages, each warm day a degree warmer than the last. What I carry instead is something more useful, the knowledge of my own ground. Where I stand. What I'm responsible for. What I will not negotiate away for the price of belonging. My classroom will fill again in September with 30-something teenagers who are learning to think critically about the past. I will tell them, as I tell them every year, that history is not what happened, it's the story we choose to tell about what happened, and why we tell it that way, and who gets to tell it. I think about that more than I used to. My name is on the foundation's donor wall now, beside Eleanor's. It was added quietly, at Jasmine's suggestion, in late spring. I didn't ask for it. I didn't prevent it either. It's a small brass plaque. Simple font. Nothing dramatic. It just says I was there. What this story ultimately reveals is not about a trust fund or a dinner table exclusion, those are the surface. Beneath them is something more fundamental, the psychology of a family that built its identity around a hierarchy it never examined, and the particular damage done to the person assigned the role of less than from the beginning. Patricia and Harold did not set out to wound Thora. That matters, and it complicates the story in ways that simple antagonism doesn't. What they did was subtler and in some ways more corrosive. They made a series of ordinary decisions, to praise Vivien's appearance, to accommodate her preferences, to protect her from discomfort, that accumulated, year by year, into a structure Thora was expected to live inside without questioning. The Thanksgiving call was not an aberration. It was the fully matured fruit of a parenting philosophy that had never been interrogated. What makes Vivien's character genuinely complex is that she was simultaneously a beneficiary and a casualty of this dynamic. She received the attention and approval that Thora was denied, but what she didn't receive was the expectation of accountability. Patricia's protection of Vivian from difficulty meant that Vivian arrived at 28 without the internal infrastructure to manage something as significant as a $15 million inheritance responsibly. Eleanor understood this. The trust structure, beneficiary and trustee deliberately separated, the more responsible daughter given control rather than capital, was not a punishment of Vivian. It was the most honest assessment of what each daughter had actually been given and what each actually needed. The Derek subplot introduces something the story handles with restraint but which deserves examination. Vivian came very close to allowing her inheritance to be used as a financing vehicle by a man whose interests were not identical to hers. The $200,000 distribution request, arriving through Vivian but originating in Derek's merger timeline, was the clearest evidence of how vulnerability to flattery and status can become financial exposure. Thora's insistence on documentation was not obstruction, it was the trust functioning exactly as Eleanor designed it. A beneficiary without a trustee, in that situation, would have been exposed. There is a pattern worth naming in how power operated in this story. For 32 years, Thora's competence had been invisible to her family, her academic achievement, her teaching career, her role in the foundation, her stewardship of the trust. None of these things registered because her family was not looking for them. They had assigned her a role and interpreted all evidence through that assignment. The Gala was not the moment she became powerful. She had always been powerful. It was the moment her family was required to update their assignment. That distinction, between being seen and becoming something worth seeing, is the story's most important psychological insight. Thora did not transform at the Gala. She simply stood still and let reality catch up to the narrative her family had been running. The dissonance was on their side, not hers. And that dissonance, Patricia's strict expression, Harold's first direct words of the evening, Vivien's quietly fractured composure, was the beginning of a more honest dynamic, because it was the first time in 32 years that the family's picture of Thora and Thora herself had occupied the same room at the same time. The partial reconciliation at the story's end is careful and earned. Thora does not forgive everything wholesale, which would have been psychologically false. She extends specific things to specific people: a continued working relationship with Vivian, a cautious new conversation with Harold, a smaller but more honest connection with Patricia. What she withholds is the old arrangement, the invisible daughter, the self-erasing presence, the person whose worth was contingent on her usefulness to someone else's story. That arrangement is over. What replaces it is real, if incomplete. What I keep coming back to, thinking about Thora's story, is the brass plaque. Not the trust, not the gala, not even the Thanksgiving call, just that small plaque on the foundation wall, the one she didn't ask for and didn't prevent. Because I think most of us who have been made to feel like the lesser version of ourselves in some relationship, a family, a workplace, a friendship, have spent years trying to earn our place in rooms where we were actually founding members all along. We convince ourselves that if we're patient enough, quiet enough, good enough in the background, eventually someone will notice. What Thora's story suggests is something harder and more freeing: they won't notice until you stop being easy to overlook. And the only person with the power to stop that is you. That's not advice. It's just what happened. And sometimes what happened is enough.